Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Al-Walid Center for Muslim Christian Understanding. I'm Tamara Hassan. I am a new member of the center, and we have a fascinating program today. Boko Haram, ISIS, and the Caliphate today, co-sponsored by African Studies Program and Security Studies here at Georgetown, with three wonderful speakers whose bios are on your little handout, so I won't go into detail on the bios. Basically, our topic is, as the title indicates, Boko Haram, ISIS, and the Caliphate. So why are we talking about those three things? Two of them are groups, as you know, ISIS or ISIL or IS or Daesh, however you want to call it, the group in Iraq and Syria, Boko Haram in northern Nigeria, and the question of the Caliphate. All of them, both ISIS and Boko Haram, use similar language about, obviously, Islam, Caliphate, and Shariah in their discourse, and especially in their public statements. And that has led to, as you may have noticed, a great deal of confusion in the general public about what Islam actually stands for. And as our speakers today will discuss, there is a significant distinction between notions of Caliphate and Sharia as presented by ISIS and Boko Haram, and what the majority of Muslims generally perceive with regard to those issues. So we're going to begin today with Professor Emad Shahin, who is a visiting professor of political science here in the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown. Each of our speakers will speak 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll have time for Q&A. Professor Shahin.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Of course, I'm very delighted to be part of this panel and contribute to the discussion. What I will do very quickly in 10 to 15 minutes is to just talk about the concept of the Caliphate and its ramifications in contemporary Muslim political thought and practice. So that's why I wanted to start first, because it will provide some kind of a general overview about the origins of the debate, what the Caliphate represents until now, until today, in the mind, and also whether, to what extent, not whether, to what extent Daesh and other Caliphate-based organizations represent an aberration or part of the discourse or the debate on a very important institution and concept, which is the Caliphate, and where is the deviation, if there's any, from the ideal model or the prophetic model that they themselves claimed to be trying to restore. Because that's the whole idea, that they are trying to restore the prophetic model of the Caliphate. Prophetic, this is very key. This is very key because this is where we can find benchmarks in order to, or criteria by which we can assess. This year is 2014, exactly 90 years ago, 1924. The Caliphate was abolished in Turkey by Kemal Ataturk. This was, of course, for the majority of Muslims, this was really a devastating shock, as it ended what could be termed as an institution that represented the symbolic unity of Muslims. I don't want to idealize anything. There was a lot of despotism associated with the Caliphate. There was a lot of tyranny. But still, there was some kind of association between the Caliphate as an institution that lasted for over 14 centuries, and also had so many things that was associated with it. The issue of, for example, the legacy itself, as many Muslims could associate, the golden age of Islam, the expansion and extension of Islam with the Caliphate itself, and this, they went hand in hand. Like the death of the Prophet, the first successor Caliph of the Prophet, Abu Bakr, and then the second Umar, and then in 30 years, all the Islamic empire or state started to expand under the institution of the Caliphate. Under the institution of the Caliph. So for Muslims, it's not something bad for majority of Muslims. Anyway, the collapse of the Caliphate, of course, created a lot of responses, intellectual, political, ideological, and of course, organizations. I'm not going to talk about all this, and excuse my sketchy presentation, because you cannot talk about the history of the Caliphate in 10 minutes, but I will try to do my best. So you have a lot of responses. You have a lot of responses. A few hailed the collapse of the caliphate, and they were so happy that it's gone. It's gone forever. Even mainstream scholars like Hamid ibn Badis and others, but the majority felt actually some kind of a loss, potential loss, some kind. Why? Because there was this association of the collapse of the caliphate and the emergence or the rise of imperialism and colonization. The collapse of the caliphate and the disintegration of the Islamic Ummah and its control for the first time by quote-unquote infidel elements, colonial powers, that started actually to, unlike the Crusaders, unlike previous invaders, started actually to change the institutional, financial, educational, legal, political structures of the Muslim community. Disintegration, feeling of loss, and so on. Of course, the very seminal book of Ali Abdel Razik came in 1925, an Egyptian intellectual who argued that the caliphate was not part of Islam, and also political authority was not part of Islam, and there should be a clear separation between religion and state. That was a landmark, of course, in the history of intellectual or Muslim intellectual discourse. That was followed. This is the importance of the book, as a matter of fact, not in the thesis itself, but actually in the response that this book prompted, because tens of books started to engage in this kind of debate and discourse and talk about the caliphate as a necessary and important institution for Muslim life. I'm not talking about only traditional scholars as Haraites or others from Tunisia or Morocco. It's stretched. I mean, or even from Indonesia and India. But I'm talking about people like, for example, Abdul Razzaq al-Sanhuri. Abdul Razzaq al-Sanhuri is an Egyptian legalist. He was in France at that time. His dissertation was actually, which he produced in 1925. It was entitled The Caliphate. And the idea, and then that was also at the same time, another book came by Muhammad Rashid Rida, the Caliphate and the Grand Imamate and so on, in which is very surprising and amazing, both argued for some kind of a confederacy as an attempt to restore it, of confederacy among or between Muslim states, and a symbolic caliph that has to be instituted. One suggested in Cyprus, Abdul Razzaq al-Sanhuri, and another one suggested in Mecca. Something like the Vatican and the European Union, a combination of the Vatican and the European Union. And that was 1925. Okay. Another aspect, of course, at political level, every aspirant king or despot wanted to become a caliph. King Fuad of Egypt wanted to become a caliph. The Imam al-Badr of Yemen wanted to become a caliph. People looked for Sharif Hussein as a caliph, potential caliph, and the emergence of potential or possible emergence of the Arab Caliphate. So there was this kind of, really movement and churn and a quest for a system that can replace the defunct or the collapsed caliphate, and also give rise to a new, meaningful political order among Arab and Muslims and so on. That aspiration always has lasted. That's one of the arguments I would like to say, that this kind of aspiration has always lasted and endured, even in the emergence of Islamic movements that decided to give up the idea. They tried, but decided to give up on the idea of establishing an immediate or restoring an immediate caliphate. However, the idea of the caliphate, the concept of the caliphate, always became embedded in their discourse, in their orientation, in their reform programs, or even as a phase. Like they go through phases, the end or the last phase would lead to the establishment of who are these movements? The Muslim Brotherhood of Egypt, of course. The Jama'at Islami in Pakistan. The raison d'etre was actually based on the restoration of the Caliph. And they are around. The movement, the Noor movement in Turkey, also called for the restoration of the Caliph. The Islamic Liberation Party, which is very contemporary, same as the Muslim Brotherhood, and has activities in 40 countries. Islamic Liberation Party, Hizb al-Tahrir al-Islami. Hizb al-Tahrir al-Islami is a political party that actually conceptualized on the idea of restoring the caliphate and so on. Now, so what I'm trying to say is that this idea, so you don't confuse like what's happening now in America, like the Sharia is an S word. The caliphate becomes, again, distorted and so on. This is not the way Muslims understand it. This is not even, of course, I'm not trying to idealize things. There were so many downsides, there were negative sides, the same thing with any political system in the region, but what I'm trying to say here is that this concept has been embedded all along in the intellect, in the programs, in the frameworks of many Islamic movements. It might not be central. Why? Because in terms of approach of change, most of these movements took eventually the differing approaches. Like some of them called for the immediate restoration, the Islamic Liberation Party. There is no kidding about this. Like in their constitution and so on, their objective is to restore the Islamic Caliphate. Muslim Brotherhood, it's one of the phases that will lead in the end to the restoration of Islamic Party. Some even thought of considering the Caliphate as a means to address the conditions, the context that led to the decline of Muslims and eventually the collapse of the Caliphate. So what's needed, not necessarily to restore it, but at least to address the same conditions, the conditions that led to the decline and the disintegration of Islamic parties and so on. Others, for example, looked at the meaning of the concept itself. What did the Caliphate for them represented? Good governance. So therefore, there are so many movements that are took the essence. The essence is what? Justice, participation, rule of law, respect of human rights, accountability of rulers, and so on. And this is actually the mainstream now trend among the Islamic movement. We'll see this in the PDG in Morocco, for example. When you talk to anyone leading, they will tell you, we're not calling for an Islamic State because already we have the commander of the faithful and the caliph, like something similar. It's not, of course, but something similar is there. The Nahda in Tunisia, of course, AK Party in Turkey, and the National Rally for Reform and Development in Mauritania. All of them have been inspired by that concept. So, now, let me just, like in whatever 5 minutes or 3 minutes that I have, switch this or relate this to where we are now. Of course, the declaration of ISIS or Daesh was to restore the prophetic model of the Caliphate. So what I will discuss now is what is this prophetic model and where is ISIS from that prophetic model, and then how that relates to the future of ISIS. I'm not going to dwell too much on this because I think Shadi is going to, to focus on that. But just, like bullet points. Now, the prophetic model of the Caliphate, we're talking about 30 years. From the time of the Prophet, his migration from Mecca to Medina and the establishment of the Islamic State, that's where this starts, all the way for 30 years. That's the prophetic model. That includes the life of the Prophet. There was no Caliphate at that time because that was the prophetic model. And then you have the rightly guided model that lasted afterwards for, I think, 23 years or something like this. Okay. Now, so where is the legitimacy of that model? And why still many Islamic movements express a desire to restore that model? One is the strong consensus. There has been there was at that time a strong communal consensus on the need to establish a political authority, and they named it Caliphate. And it came actually by expedience. Like the first one was, the Caliph, and then the second one was the Caliph of the Prophet. The third one will be the Caliph of the Caliph of the Caliph. So it's just, like a name. And they picked another name, which is the commander of the faith, Amir al-Mu'mineen, for example. So it's not the names, it's the meaning itself. Again, it's also based on, as I mentioned, a very kind of idealized historic legacy. When you talk about the Caliphate, for people who really kind of, have some kind of sympathy towards the Caliphate, the first thing that comes to mind is what? Baghdad. That's right. The golden age of Islam. Harun al-Rashid. And all these ideas, if you go look at the Lawrence of Arabia, the same thing. How Baghdad was lit, with lights, street lights, and so on, while Europe was living in the dark ages and stuff like that. The intellectual life, flourishing of Islamic civilization, that was also part of the Caliphate. Again, there were setbacks, there was despotism, and so on, but at least it was an indigenous expression. Now, it also rested on, and that's where the ISIS fails, on consent, freedom of selection of the ruler, on qualification. I'm talking about the ideal model, the prophetic model. Legitimacy based on merits and deeds, consultation, oversight, accountability of ruler, participation, right to question rulers, equality before the law, and protection of rights. You tell me, oh, this sounds very kind of modern. Where did you get this from? I got that from classical text, the first speech of Abu Bakr, and you can refer to Charles Kurzman's book, because I have a translation of Ibn Bathis's treatise on the 13 principles that he deduced from the first speech of Abu Bakr. And these are all there. Abu Bakr was the first caliph. Abu Bakr was the first successor to the Prophet. So all these elements are there. The Caliphate also supposedly exercised sovereignty over vast territories and demanded nominal allegiance until even the 20th century. Like if you look at the Ottoman Empire, it was weak, disintegrating and everything, and had to grant some territories, some how can we call it? Maybe kingdoms, sultanates, whatever, special status like Morocco, Yemen, Kuwait, and others. But there in Friday prayers, there was some kind of nominal allegiance to the caliph. Now, if you look at the statement of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, who claimed the caliphate, of course, the statement was very shrewdly crafted, and actually, despite the ostensible reflection that would like to project, you can read between the lines, and it falls directly with the objectives of the declaration of the caliphate from ISIS perspective itself. So if you look at it, of course, this is the message that he's directing to Muslims: raise up your heads. I'm just highlights. You live in a state that will restore your dignity. Arab Spring, dignity revolutions, Sawrat al-Karama, and will restore your rights and your sovereignty. He's talking to Muslims. It's a state for all Muslims. Oil, money, riches, so we all share that. It's your duty to migrate to it. And then he addresses, he made a direct address to those who have qualifications, doctors, engineers, scholars, scientists, come to that state and migrate to that state. And then he says, listen, O nation of Islam, Ummah of Islam, now it's the time for you to rise up. Stand up. Liberate yourself from the shackles of weakness. He's playing exactly on the sentimental aspects of that every Muslim intellectual started to explain. What are the reasons of Muslim decline, and how can we restore Muslim prowess, and so on. Okay. Now, how is that relates to what I said about the prophetic model? No territorial, yes. Oh, thank you. 1 minute, just 1 minute. No territorial sovereignty. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi does not. What I'm trying to say is that ISIS as a caliphate does not fulfill the basic fundamental requirements of any caliphate. Why? No territorial sovereignty, no recognition, no political sovereignty even. When he issued the statement, of course, he issued the statement and the declaration of the caliphate without consulting with the main leaders of the Qaeda, and as a result, that created a lot of friction between the top leaders. The main ideologues of the Salafi movement, the main ideologues of the Salafi jihadi movements condemned his declaration and actually attacked this caliphate as a clear distortion of Islam, especially with the beheading that this state is undertaking. And they said, you are distorting jihad, you are distorting the Sharia, and distorting Islam itself. That included Muhammad al-Maqdisi, Abu Qatada, Abu Nasr al-Tartusi, Sulaiman al-Alwani, Hani al-Sibai. The main Muslim scholars, more than 200 Muslim scholars, also condemned the declaration of the caliphate. So there are other things, the qualification we don't know about, and it doesn't make any sense that someone just declares single-handedly himself or proclaim himself as a caliph and gets allegiance from 10,000 or even 20,000. That's not binding, and that's what all the scholars, Muslim scholars, said. Where is the origins come from of that declaration? Of course, in the vacuum that has been created as a result of the collapse of the nation state in Iraq or Syria, and also as the power struggle. Okay? Now, and also in the conflict between Al-Qaeda and ISIS itself. That's where it comes from. Let me stop here. Let me stop here because we can handle, the future and so on in question, because I don't want to also prefigure what Shadi is going to say as well.
And that's an excellent stopping point. Thank
Exactly.
you so much.
Thank you.
Dr. Shahin, so setting up the discussion beautifully and ending on that point of the competition between ISIS and Al-Qaeda, and we will have plenty of time for Q&A. Let us move now to Dr. Shadi Hamid from Brookings Institution. Straight away, bio is on your handout.
Okay, great. Thanks, Tamara, and thanks to the ACMCU. When I was a student at Georgetown, it was a CMCU. And it's great to see my at least three of my former professors here, so it's a pleasure to be back. I'll start with the role of ideology, drawing on some of what Professor Shahin said, and then go into the political and regional context. So first of all, a few decades ago, you had Orientalist and Neo-Orientalist scholars who really emphasized the role of ideology and doctrine in understanding modern Islam and modern Muslims. And it seemed odd, and it still seems odd, that you would try to read the Quran to understand how and why modern Muslims act in the present political context. And I think that over the last few decades, we've moved maybe too much in the other direction, and especially as a political scientist, we've de-emphasized the role of ideas, ideology, doctrine, belief, Islam, and very much emphasized the contingencies of political structure and context. So almost going to the point where Islam, with quotation marks, is epiphenomenal. Islam or ideology are simply products of various material factors, tangible political factors. I think in light of recent events, we have to correct a little bit. That's not to say we go back to a kind of cultural essentialism, but I think we have to find a middle ground where we take ideas and theology seriously as independent drivers in their own right. And that's why I thought Professor Shahin's introductory remarks were fascinating, because he's taking the idea of the Caliphate very seriously, and I think we should. It's the historical resonance of the Caliphate. Now, what does it mean if we start to look at Islam or ideology, however you want to look at it, and we can debate that, as independent variables? And I think there's a couple recent examples where we see that in a very kind of stark, powerful fashion, the power of ideology to overwhelm those who are less committed ideologically. So we saw the fall of Sana'a just a few weeks ago, and I just think about that for a second. The capital of a major Arab state fell, and apparently not a lot of people care so much about that. I think it's a big deal. But what was so striking about it, it's very different than ISIS, but we see the Houthi rebels, who are really a small group of ideologically committed rebels, a few thousand fighters, who are able to overwhelm what was ostensibly a U.S.-backed and trained army, the Yemeni army. We see something similar in Iraq, where you have 30,000 troops and police forces of the Iraqi National Army in Mosul, and you have just about 800 ISIS fighters who are able to overwhelm them, which shows you that in the context of a political power and ideological vacuum in the region, small groups who share a strong ideological commitment to something, whatever that might be, have a kind of built-in advantage. And we can kind of draw that analogy further, and even if we look at mainstream Islamist movements that participate or try to participate in the democratic process, whenever you would have elections in, say, Tunisia or Egypt post-Arab Spring, groups like the Muslim Brotherhood would actually come out with relatively low popular support according to public opinion polls. So Ennahda would get 20% in public opinion polls, but they would end up winning 40% in elections, because the fact that there was an ideological coherence to these movements gave them an advantage in democratic elections in terms of getting out the vote. So there are a lot of examples of this. Now, the residence of the Caliphate is a very important point, and in a lot of the discourse over the past few weeks, I think that a lot of us who focus on Islamist movements have been reticent to go too much in this direction, simply because, it should go without saying that the vast majority of Muslims disagree profoundly with what ISIS stands for. And we always have to start with that disclaimer. It should be self-evident. But at the same time, as I think Professor Shahin was able to sketch out, there is something powerful about the idea if we separate it from the context of ISIS specifically. And that's where ISIS's marketing and the way it's tried to portray itself to Muslims throughout the world has been very smart. To announce a caliphate is a pretty great marketing move, because you know that just using that word is going to force a lot of Muslims to at least think about what that word means in the context of their own historical memory. I would say that the vast majority of Muslims, even those who are quite secular, do have a kind of emotional tie to the idea. And even growing up in a secularized American Muslim community in Pennsylvania, I used to grow up with these kinds of discussions, and maybe not so much the caliphate specifically, but something even broader than that we used to be the greatest civilization the world had ever seen, and then we encountered the most precipitous decline in human history. So it's what we were compared to what we are now, and so much of what we're discussing and debating today is making sense of that gap. How did we go from there to here? And I think we have to take that basic idea, that historical context, very seriously. Now, the fact that ISIS has done what no extremist movement did before it, announce a caliphate, is very important because they've removed a mental block. So from now on, it's worth noting that Al-Qaeda wasn't that ambitious. And this is where Al-Qaeda seems like a somewhat conservative organization. Because the caliphate had so much historical weight, they didn't want to mess with that. Because once you start going in that direction, you open up a Pandora's box. Where ISIS is such a revolutionary organization is they said, we're going to mess with that. We're going to talk about that, and we're actually going to do it. And from now on, and this is why I think we can't really undo the damage that has been done. Every time there's a governance vacuum and you have an extremist group somewhere in the vicinity, they're going to think to themselves, well, should we establish a kind of emirate or mini caliphate and try to govern? Al-Qaeda didn't really have real aspirations to governance. ISIS does. And I'm sure that Alex will talk about how Boko Haram sees this in their own context. Now, let me then because this aspect of governance is very important. And this is where I want to make a point about how ideology relates to political context. So even if we have, so you're going to have a strong, you're going to have this strong ideological motivation where you have various extremist Islamist movements that are going to have significant minority support. But then the actual result of that, the product of that, is very much dependent on a whole array of intermediary factors. Political context, regional proxy battles, failures of governance, so on and so forth. And it's very clear that ISIS has been able to draw on the fact that we're seeing the collapse of the regional order, and more specifically, the collapse, at least in some parts of the region, of the secular state system. The modern nation state is eroding, if not collapsing altogether. And these modern nation states have failed, certainly in the case of Iraq and Syria, have failed to control their own territory and failed to provide basic social services in many areas that they control. So where ISIS comes in, they're not just offering a kind of ideological vision, they're also offering a model of governance. And yes, I should say it's a very low bar, so keep that in mind. But they have offered one of the most successful models of Islamist governance that we've seen. And again, the bar's low. I mean, we have, I suppose, the Taliban, Iran. We don't really have examples of mainstream Islamist movements governing for any significant period of time. So we can't really say what the Muslim Brotherhood would do. But this is where I get to another very key point, is that, as I see it, one of the major failures of the Arab Spring was the failure of the existing secular state system to accommodate Islamist political participation. So we have the alternative to ISIS, mainstream Islamist movements that are committed to the democratic process. They might be deeply illiberal, religiously conservative, otherwise very problematic, but they were committed to working within a democratic process. But for a variety of reasons, especially in the case of Egypt, the state system wasn't able or willing to accommodate their political participation. So ISIS comes in now and they say, look at the Brotherhood model. It was an utter failure. They told you to be gradualist. They told you to wait 30, 50, 80 years for the Islamic State. And no one's even with all their compromises and concessions, the state system isn't willing to accommodate them. So we're going to come and impose the Islamic State by brute force. They're essentially making an argument that violence works. And unfortunately, in the context of the post-Arab Spring Arab world, they have been vindicated. If we look time and time again, violence, unfortunately, as much as we don't like it, works. Doesn't mean it's going to work in the long run, but it's working now. And the fact that they control a swath of territory that's comparable to the UK, I've heard different estimates about the number of people who live under ISIS rule, but it's between 4 and 8 million. So this is a pretty serious endeavor. And on this, oh wow, that went really quick. Okay, So ISIS has been able to offer a model. For those of you who are interested in this issue a bit more, the best article on ISIS's model of governance, it was published by the website Jihadology the other month. It's a kind of case study of ISIS rule in a Syrian town called Manbij. So search that. It's a fascinating account of what they actually do in very specific detail. This is a town of about 100,000 people. Moving on, as I close up here. Now, what does this mean going forward? And I just want to offer, so I think it's very problematic from a U.S. policy standpoint that the Obama administration has essentially articulated a narrow counterterrorism strategy to fight what is primarily not a terrorist organization. That's where the governance component becomes very important. That's where the ideological component becomes very important. We can't effectively confront an enemy that we insist on mischaracterizing. And that's why the nature of the threat we face, I don't want to say it's unprecedented, but at least in recent decades, it is unprecedented. And which is why I think ISIS or something like it will be with us not just for the next 1 to 2 years, but for 3, 5, 10 years, God knows how long. So we have to think about what a long-term strategy looks like, and where I feel that ISIS is going to be able to continue to draw strength from is a failing regional order. We have these endless regional proxy battles, and the fact that the regional order that we're still tied to as Americans is very much tied to the Saudi conception of the regional order, and that should give us pause. That's probably not going to work out so well in the long run, because if failures of governance and democracy are one contributing factor to the rise of extremism and political violence, the long-term strategy for confronting ISIS has to have something to say about governance and democracy. And the fact that this strategy, as the Obama administration has outlined it, is very thin. It actually very consciously avoids even using the word democracy, I think that shows us that we're not really up to the challenge that we're facing, which is why I think that we're going to have to think more creatively and strategically on the 5, 10 to 15 years long-term aspect of it. I don't think we're doing it yet, and I hope over the next few months and few years there's going to be serious thinking in this town about what that longer-term strategy looks like. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Professor Hamid. Again, so much to think about and to discuss, but let's move first to our third speaker, Professor Alex Thurston, who's Professor of African Studies here at Georgetown. Again, 15 minutes, please.
Well, thank you all for coming, and thanks to ACMCU for organizing this panel. I think it's important and timely. Given that less is known about Boko Haram than about ISIS, I thought it would be useful for me first to sketch Boko Haram's evolution over time, and then second to talk about some of the features of Boko Haram's nascent Islamic State in northeastern Nigeria. So to turn first to Boko Haram's evolution over time, I would divide it into 4 phases. First, I would put a prehistory, which is extremely murky. Most sources, Nigerian sources, academic sources, put the movement's founding at 2002, but some people have taken it back and traced its emergence to student groups in the city of Maiduguri in northeastern Nigeria in the 1990s. So there's this very murky, prehistory, which would be the first phase. The second phase is what I would call a period of open preaching, particularly in the city of Maiduguri. So the founder of Boko Haram was a man named Mohammed Yusuf, who was born in 1970 in northeastern Nigeria. And at least during the early phase of his preaching, he had connections and positive relationships with what I would call mainstream Salafis in northern Nigeria. So he was somebody who was accepted within that fold and was able to preach openly in the city. His main messages, first of all, were a really exclusive sense of loyalty to what he regarded as the true Muslim community, and an intense disavowal of anyone he considered non-Muslims or un-Islamic systems. So flowing from that are the 2 ideas that Boko Haram, I think, is most famous for, one being a rejection of Western education, and the other being a rejection of the permissibility of Muslims working for secular government. This idea of a rejection of Western education, I think, should be viewed pretty broadly. I think when Yusuf was rejecting Western education, he was not only rejecting certain kinds of schooling, but also the products of that schooling. I think when Yusuf and when a lot of Nigerians, even Nigerians who don't have any sympathy for Boko Haram, when they look at Nigeria's post-colonial history, they see corruption, they see massive economic inequality. Yusuf attributed that in large part to, the products of the system of Western education, who he thought had been, corrupt and disconnected from the needs of ordinary people. He also saw the Nigerian state as fundamentally anti-Islamic and anti-Muslim, as a state that had, for decades, persecuted and killed Muslims. And I think it's, one thing that often gets left out in discussions about Boko Haram is that, particularly early on, I think Boko Haram saw itself actually as the victim of the state. I think we're used to thinking of Boko Haram as the aggressor, but I think in their own mind, they were victims of the state and part of a broader pattern of persecution against Muslims. And so Yusuf, by preaching against Western education and its fruits, and by preaching against corruption, he was able to draw, a certain audience, particularly of young men. The social base of Boko Haram is another murky aspect of the group. A lot of, analyses have talked about Quranic students, itinerant Quranic students making up the social base of the movement. I think that's a good guess, but the hard evidence for that claim is not necessarily there. But in any case, Yusuf does seem to have drawn a number of young men who were angry about corruption, angry about perceived persecution of Muslims. He was able to draw them to his movement. And for the most part, during the second phase from about 2002 to 2009, he was able to preach openly Some of his followers in late 2003, 2004 were involved in some clashes in a neighboring state to Maiduguri in Borno state. And the connection between Yusuf and that uprising has never been clear, but Yusuf at least felt sufficiently nervous afterwards that he took off to Saudi Arabia for a few months, but then was able to come back and resume his open preaching. There also seems to have been some understanding or accommodation between Yusuf and local politicians at this time, particularly a governor of Borno state. All through Nigeria, politicians and state governors make use of youth movements in politics, particularly at election time, to intimidate rivals, to secure support, to help with rigging elections. And Yusuf and the sort of proto-Boko Haram may have been one group, particularly in the 2003 elections, that helped with that kind of activity. Toward the end of this phase of open preaching, Yusuf and this governor fell out, and Yusuf came to feel that there was more and more persecution directed against his followers. And in 2009, a series of confrontations between Boko Haram and the police escalated into a massive uprising that Yusuf and his followers launched across several states in northeastern Nigeria. At that point, Yusuf was killed after he was taken into police custody. Over 800 people died, and the movement was effectively suppressed. Then I would talk about a third phase, which would be from 2010 until probably this year. And that phase I would call just guerrilla attacks. So Boko Haram resurfaced in the fall of 2010 and began to carry out all kinds of different attacks. So drive-by shootings from the backs of motorbikes, attacks on schools, attacks on churches and beer parlors, bombings and suicide bombings, including not just in northeastern Nigeria, but also in the capital, Abuja. Massive attacks on cities in the north like Kano, and all kinds of other, different tactics, but mostly, guerrilla tactics. Then, and those attacks, by the way, have, been mostly confined to northeastern Nigeria and to other parts of the north and to Abuja, but over the summer, Abu Bakr Shekau, the new leader of Boko Haram, claimed responsibility for a bombing in the city of Lagos, which is in southwestern Nigeria and is the commercial heart of Nigeria. So then I think this summer, it seemed that Boko Haram might have entered a fourth phase, and that would be characterized by two things. One, a bid to take and hold territory, instead of attacking and fading away, to try to hold territory. And then second, a capacity and a willingness to engage the Nigerian military, openly in combat. So in July and August, Boko Haram started to capture towns in northeastern Nigeria, including some fairly sizable towns with tens of thousands of people. Damboa, Gwoza, which is sort of the site or the center of Boko Haram's nascent state. Boko Haram also, increasingly shows off its military capabilities. So, videos from Boko Haram will show armored personnel carriers and rocket launchers, and the reports coming out of northeastern Nigeria suggest that the Nigerian soldiers are increasingly frightened of taking on Boko Haram, even in open combat. So it's still early, but I think we could say that Boko Haram is moving into this fourth phase. So, what does it mean that Boko Haram might have an Islamic State in northeastern Nigeria? First, I think there's two cautions that are in order. One, there were headlines after Abu Bakr Shekau, the leader, put out a video in July. There were headlines that Boko Haram had voiced support for ISIS, and I think that got things subtly wrong. In the video, Abu Bakr Shekau had said, he had expressed solidarity with Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, but also with Ayman al-Zawahiri and with Mullah Omar of the Taliban. And I think Yusuf, like some other jihad leaders, or not Yusuf Shekau, like other jihad leaders around the world, was trying to, figure his way through the conflict between ISIS and Al-Qaeda. So not necessarily expressing support for al-Baghdadi, but expressing solidarity with a whole host of jihad leaders. But the headlines coming out of the video were, Boko Haram voices support for ISIS, and so I think the media got things subtly wrong on that. The second issue is, I'm not sure that Boko Haram has a caliphate. I mean, the word that they've used in Arabic is dawla, which I suppose one could translate as caliphate, but I think Boko Haram might mean it as just more state, which is the traditional, meaning that I associate with the word, at least. In Gwoza, Shakau, speaking in Arabic, said that God had made Gwoza, dawlatan min duwal al-Islam, so a state among the states of Islam. And I don't think, in comparing it to al-Baghdadi's declaration, I don't think, Shakau had the same kind of nuance or calculation or systematic, kind of declaration that one would expect if he was really declaring a caliphate. He didn't take a new name. He didn't even really give too many details about what this Islamic State would look like. So it's still early on, but I guess I'm thinking of Boko Haram's, polity that they're carving out as a state rather than as a caliphate. I think we could still talk about, some features of this Islamic State. So one would be persecution and killings of Christians, punishment of perceived sins, or violations of public morality. So there were reports that Boko Haram had executed a few, smokers in one town that it had occupied. Shakau has not given a lot of details about what it's going to look like, but he said, in this state we're going to rule by the Quran and the Sunnah, and so he's at least attempting to, I think, actualize a little bit of the prophetic model that Professor Shahin was talking about, but again, he hasn't given too many details, so it's hard to know exactly what this means, that they're going to rule by the Quran and the Sunnah. Going forward, I think, it looks like Boko Haram has further territorial ambitions. They've taken a number of mid-sized towns around the city of Maiduguri, which is a city of over 1 million people and a state capital. If they were able to take Maiduguri, I think that would be a real turning point and a real sign that the Nigerian government has decisively lost authority in part of the country. And going forward, I mean, the Nigerian state is having, tremendous difficulty addressing Boko Haram. There's, national elections coming up in February 2015, which is going to be a turbulent time for Nigeria. And so I think the next few months, could see continued momentum with Boko Haram. So, thanks.